packed few days here in Singapore. On stage, we've seen so many cool, interesting talks from people ranging from banks to university professors to DeFi builders, and I'm excited to learn more about all those topics they were discussing. And off stage, there have been so many great conversations coming out of the synergies of so many people passionate about the XRPL all in one place. And I'm sure those connections will last beyond today. David, I'm curious to hear what stood out to you the most.
Well, I mean, this is the 5th year of Apex. It was massive. It was amazing. In the very beginning, the idea was to bring developers together and to talk about strategy for the development of the XRP ledger, hear what developers wanted. And then it gradually expanded over the years to include retail speculators and tech enthusiasts. And then, coming closer to this year, researchers, students. And this year, institutions are finally on board, and that feels like an exciting turning point.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the big thing about this one was bringing like DeFi developers, people who are building software for mass adoption, grassroots, together with people who are looking to bring institutional tools to the XRP ledger to provide the next generation of DeFi. And that was just super exciting.
So we started with asking the community for a lot of questions, but I snuck in one of my own just to get started first. A topic near and dear to my heart. There's a lot of interest right now around programmability on the XRPL, with smart escrows on the native front and the EVM sidechain as well. From your perspective, what's the real unlock here? What kind of use cases do you hope we'll start seeing built?
The XRP ledger was purpose-built to solve specific financial use cases with the DEX, issued assets, escrows, forthcoming loans. I think we'll be able to address the major financial use cases through native transactors that implement the functionality that people need, like loans will be able to be done that way. But I think that you can only target something like the most valuable, most important sort of 80% of those use cases, which is great. You could be very successful just targeting the most interesting 80%. But I'm hoping that with smart transactors, we can sort of expand to get to use cases that we can almost hit, that we just need a little bit more flexibility to hit. I think also there's some very specific use cases that can probably only be done through a little bit of a smart contract. So one example would be trustless bridging or trust minimized bridging. All of the great bridging solutions and interoperability solutions that we're seeing require just a little bit more flexibility than we can get from from smart transactors that don't have programmability. So I'm hoping that with just a little bit of programmability, we can just get a lot of bang for the buck. And I don't want to turn the XRP ledger into another, Turing-complete Ethereum clone. But I also don't want us to be cut out from functionality that we could have. And so I think we can get a lot of interesting additional use cases that have real-world value and still preserve things like fast transactions, low and predictable transaction fees, and the security and reliability of not doing everything through a smart contract.
I couldn't agree more.
We'll see.
We also asked the community on X to share their questions they had for David. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them because you just had way too many really great questions, but we picked a few of our favorites. No topics were off limits. So let's get this started.
Can I pass on a couple of them? I don't know. Am I allowed to do that?
Well, it's an ask me anything, not I will answer anything.
Okay. I'll see what I can do.
So our first question here is from Issa. What milestones are you hoping XRP achieves in the next 5 years?
Well, 5 years is a long time. I think we can get a lot done in 5 years. I think the big thing that we can probably accomplish in 5 years is just making the ecosystem feel like an ecosystem. People being able to, millions of people who have access to blockchain tools and who are potential customers for new DeFi solutions. 5 years is a long time. We could have mass enterprise adoption. We could have users who live their entire economic lives right on a blockchain.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, looking at XRP specifically, I think we're going to have a long tail of assets with things like tokenized lending pools and tokenized real estate portfolios and fractional ownership. There's going to be an enormous number of assets, and people are going to need liquidity between them. So I think XRP could be that intermediary asset. We can accomplish a lot in 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be great to see. Our next question here is from Rose. If you could only eat one Singaporean dish for the rest of your life, what would it be?
You know, there's a lot of great Singaporean dishes, but I got to give it up for chili crab. And it's just an incredible. You would not think, you know, crab is sweet and kind of a delicate kind of protein. You wouldn't think that you could combine it with the spiciness, but it somehow magically works.
Sounds like a lot of people in the crowd agree.
Yeah, haven't got any chili crab fans here?
I'm vegetarian, so I wouldn't know.
I don't know. What do you think, guys think about chili imitation crab? Would it work? What do you think? No? Sorry, you're out of luck. Find some. Vegetarian dishes don't have to like pretend to be non-vegetarian.
It's true.
Just, you know, maybe that's just not the dish for you.
Yeah, maybe there's chili tofu or chili something else that gets the same concept.
Not a Singaporean specialty, though.
I guess not. I think the Singaporeans, hopefully they're not offended by my suggestions.
It sounds like they might have been.
Yeah. I apologize. It's my first time here. I'm still learning.
Oh, you got a couple supporters.
Sounds like some of you are on my side. All right, our next question here is from Caspian. What's one overlooked feature of the XRP ledger today that you think will look obvious in hindsight 5 years from now?
You know, I really hope it's the social credit feature. I love this feature so much. It gets a lot of hate. It hasn't gotten a lot of traction. There's a lot of misunderstanding. Let me explain how cool this is. This came from Ryan Fugger, the original Ripple Pay project back in 2004. And Ryan had this idea that is the most like, it is the most cypherpunk idea out there. He had this idea that instead of money being something that the government created, money could be created by interactions among people. So if I do you a favor and you know, you owe me one, that could be an asset that I could hold. And if somebody needs a favor from you, they would want to get that asset from me. And so they might give me something in exchange for that asset. And the XRP ledger has this feature fully implemented through trust lines. So I can say, you know, I'm willing to extend a certain amount of credit to you. Think of it as like a loan. You know, if you needed money, you know, one of the horrible ways to get it is like a credit card advance or a personal loan. But you probably have friends who'd be willing to loan you money if you didn't have to go through the awkward mechanics of it. Like you have to ask me to borrow money, and what if I say no, and what if you forget to repay me? The XRP ledger allows you to extend credit to people. They can take those loans on demand, and you can settle them on demand. And it's got this incredible system built into it that virtually nobody is using, and I really would love for it to get traction. I personally think it's incredibly cool. It's a great alternative to government-issued fiat, and I don't know, I seem to be in the minority on this one. Nobody seems to agree with me, but I personally just really like it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's why issued tokens are sometimes called IOUs, right?
Yeah. We got any IOU fans here? Any people who like that idea of a sort of social credit system where you borrow from your network of friends? Oh, we got a couple. Okay. All right. I know it's associated with this negative idea that like people who are socially disfavored will sort of be economically exiled. But at least it'd be transparent, right? Better than it happening in secret.
All right, our next question here is from Vet. Is there any protocol incentive model that you find would work with the current XRPL philosophies? In other words, do you still think that the best incentive is no incentive is current?
You know, I still think the best incentive is no incentive for block production specifically. I still think that's right. But you know, I think there are protocol incentive models that could work with the current XRP philosophy. I don't like them. I'm generally against them. But people obviously don't have to agree with me just because it's me. Like, I'll give you an example. Imagine if programmability does very well on the XRP ledger and it gets a lot of traction. And we start to get these transactions that are very complex because they do a whole bunch of stuff. So you could imagine that the fee for those transactions would have to be a lot larger than the fees for current transactions. And we don't really have any currently established norm for how those transaction fees would go. So if we change the rules for transaction fees on normal transactions, let's say we give them all to me. Matt, so any supporters of that rule? No, but like that would be really weird. That would upset some really settled expectations. But we don't have settled expectations for these additional fees that smart contracts might pay. So you can imagine a community agreement that maybe that should go to the validators. Like that could happen, and that would fit in with the way the XRP ledger is. Again, I personally don't think that's a good idea, but maybe there's some version of it that might be persuasive and that people might like. And so I do think that best incentive is no incentive for block production is still current, but there are definitely ways that you could imagine doing it differently that maybe people would like.
Yeah, I mean, one risk with that is definitely that if you are only giving fees out for the programmable transactions, maybe validators will start to prioritize those transactions over normal transactions.
And that gets to the reason why I'm generally not in favor of those things. Like the thing that I imagine is like, imagine if you and I are both validators, and you're like a great validator, and I'm a terrible validator. But I really like the fees I'm getting. So I kind of don't want you to be a validator, because however many fees there are, there's only so many, and we're sharing them. And so it creates sort of artificial conflict and inside the ecosystem. And it can cause a race to the bottom like you see with mining and even to some extent staking. So yeah, my preference is generally not to do those things. I generally think we should look to other areas for incentives. But you don't have to agree with me.
Put everybody else on the negative UNL so you get all the fees.
Well, I would point out one important thing about the UNL is that it only affects validation. It does not affect consensus. It doesn't affect your way to, well, whether or not it affect if we ever did fee splitting, of course, would be open. But I would lean towards having the negative UNL not affect fee splitting for just that reason. And so like for now, if I put you on the negative UNL, that does not affect your ability to participate in the consensus process. So you still participate in consensus fully. It just affects the validation process. In other words, we don't wait for you if you're not responding. But if you are responding, it's one of the cool things about negative UNL is it isn't really as much a threat to decentralization. But then again, if you're not validating, can we let you have a share of fees? Probably not. And so now it gets complicated.
Yeah, it does. So our next question is from Crippen Ryder. Are there any plans on adding concentrated liquidity provisioning like Uniswap v3 to the native XRPL AMM, or is this something that we'd really only ever see on the EVM sidechain?
There has been some discussion about this inside the team. I spoke with Anshul about this. When we designed the AMM feature, we had in mind volatility harvesting and XRP as as one of the assets as the primary use case, and it's very built for that. The trade-off is it doesn't provide liquidity as efficiently. If you imagined an AMM between RLUSD and like USDC or Bitstamp USD, there better not be much volatility to harvest, right? Like if the rate of exchange between two USD stablecoins is fluctuating a lot, they're terrible stablecoins. And so we don't want to optimize for volatility harvesting. So we have talked about having a knob or some sort of tuning that would allow you to switch it to be more towards liquidity providing and less towards volatility harvesting. But in the short term, yeah, you can easily do that on an EVM sidechain. I think it's one of the benefits of smart contracts is that you can tune to any niche or weird use case, and it's a lot harder for us to do that in our world.
Yeah, during a workshop I ran on Tuesday, we had some conversations about smart AMMs, which could be one way you implement that knob.
Yeah, it's actually a great example. Like, this is a pretty significant problem of capital inefficiency in providing liquidity, and you might think you need some big, complicated solution to it, but really, it's just changing there's a curve inside the AMM that determines how it changes its price in relationship to how its balance is shifted. It's a very constrained, you have a certain input, I have this much of this asset and this much of this asset, like what should my price be? It's very constrained, and so you could implement it with a smart contract that only processes that one piece of information. It's a good example of an extension that could provide much more efficient liquidity provision on the DEX, which is a pretty high payoff for a pretty low investment.
Yeah. All right, our next question here is from Decoded. When you imagine the XRPL ecosystem in 2030, what's something that you hope it does that it doesn't today, whether technical, cultural, economic?
Let's see, 2030, that's what, 15? Well, my brain thinks it's 2015 somehow. Well, that's only 5 years away. Wow, that doesn't seem right.
I know, right?
Anyway, what do I hope that it does that it doesn't do today? Seamless interoperability, I think, is the big one. if users have to think about where things are, they're going to get a terrible experience. The great thing about the internet, when you use the internet, you don't have to think about where you are or where the server is or what technology it's using, what operating system it's running, whether it's connected by fiber, right? The internet just works, right? And so as a result, when you build tools for the internet, everybody can use them. It's the same thing with phones. Like, why are phones such a great platform? You okay, you have to make two versions, right? One for Android, one for iPhone. But once you've built those two versions, you have tens of millions of people who can access your product or service immediately. There's no barrier. If they don't like it, now they just get rid of your app. If they like it, they continue to use it. I think what I want it to do that it doesn't do today is provide that kind of seamlessness, to provide a target market that people can aim their products and services at and provide that user experience where you feel like there's a million different things that you can do and they all just work.
Right.
5 years, it might be a little tough.
Right, it should all just work like magic and you shouldn't need to know how a network protocol works to use the internet.
That's how every technology gets mass adoption. So in the early days of almost every technology, you had to understand it very deeply in order to use it. And it's very difficult for any technology to get mass adoption that way. In the early days of computers, you had to build it yourself. You had to install the operating system yourself. In the early days of the internet, you had to edit DOS batch files with TCP/IP set. Right? But the way you get early printers were terrible and broke down all the time. The way you get to mass adoption is when you solve a problem and the user doesn't have to think about the how.
Absolutely.
Unless they really want to. We are definitely in the enthusiast phase now, where it's very difficult to use blockchain products or services unless you very deeply understand how they work under the hood.
Yeah.
And we'll never get mass adoption that way.
Our next question is from the Natural Cube. Why was the Ethereum network given priority for RLUSD over the XRPL?
Well, I don't think the Ethereum network was given priority. We definitely decided to launch on two chains because obviously if it was going to be one, it would just be the XRP ledger. But it doesn't really feel like it's a premium stablecoin
right.
on one chain. And so Ethereum was the obvious choice, because of their traction. I think what we're hoping is that as institutional use cases ramp up on the XRP ledger, RLUSD will emerge as a settlement asset, payment
right.
asset. As Hidden Road starts using RLUSD for collateral, we expect to see those things on the XRP ledger. So the choice of the XRP ledger was obvious. The choice of having more than one blockchain was pretty obvious. And the choice for the second blockchain being Ethereum was pretty clear just because of its size. So, and we're currently trying to weigh adding more blockchains versus going deeper into the existing blockchains.
Right.
And obviously, going deeper into the XRP ledger is a very, very high priority for us through things like partnerships and building additional functionality where RLUSD can be useful. Loan portfolios, like when you take loans, one of the ways is you can get paid with RLUSD. When you want to buy into those tokenized portfolios, RLUSD can be a payment asset and a settlement asset. And so we hope to grow that on the XRP ledger going into the future.
Yeah, sounds great to me. Our next question is from Khaled El-Awadi. How significant will permission domains be in enabling regulatory compliance and attracting large institutions into the XRPL ecosystem?
I think it's going to be very significant. A thorn in my side and a thorn in the side of Ripple for a long time has been the fact that we can't use the XRP ledger DEX for our own payments products. I want to rip my hair out. So it's obvious that we would do that, and it's frustrating that endlessly frustrating that we can't. And the primary obstacle is that Ripple is a regulated institution,
right.
and if our trade passes through a terrorist or somebody who's sanctioned by the United States, it doesn't matter whether we knew or could have known. Or basically, if there's a chance that can happen, we just can't do it.
Right. And
so we have not been able to use the DEX, and it's just And so permission domains will enable a domain in which you have to prove you're not a terrorist to get into that domain. And so that will mean that lots of ordinary people, I made the joke at my other presentation, I said, all of us could get into that. Probably not that guy in the second row. Yeah. That joke killed earlier. But the idea is that these will not be just institutions to institutions. Why put that on the XRP ledger, right? That should be on a private ledger. But the idea is that ordinary people will be in these permission domains. They'll be able to provide liquidity. They'll be able to consume liquidity. They'll be able to arbitrage between inside and outside the domain. And finally, enterprises that want to use the DEX to settle payments and move assets and provide liquidity on the DEX will be able to do so. So I think it's going to be very significant as part of the sort of wave of institutional adoption. And those higher flows and those higher volumes on the DEX are going to bring value to all of the developers on the ledger.
Yeah. I'm a little biased in being a fan of permission domains because I wrote the spec.
You know, the very first vision for permission domains goes back to 2014.
Oh, really?
We had this idea for something we called regulatory domains. And the idea was that an account could put itself in a sort of a jurisdiction, and that could control things like maybe there's a court that could order some accounts frozen or order, and you can't currently do that with XRP because it has no issuer. But you could opt into a regulatory domain that had some authority that could do that, and it could have rules about how assets can move in and out. And there was never really a good product market fit for that because it wasn't solving a real problem that anyone had. Was permission domains, it really is a problem that institutions that want to use the DEX can't. That's frustrating. And when you have a technology that solves a problem and the people who have that problem can't use it, it just bothers me.
I guess no idea is really truly original if you thought of the same thing 10 years before I did.
Well, there are some big differences. I think it's more aimed at a very specific problem, and it's more of a decentralized. It's less of a compromise of because it does seamlessly. Because people can be in a domain and still interact with people outside that domain. It's not like they don't take anything away. Whereas the original idea kind of does take things away.
Yeah, that's fair. Our next question is from Mike Richette. So, do you expect widespread adoption of the XRPL to be closer to 1, 3, or maybe 5 years? What does that widespread adoption look like? And is the XRPL infinitely scalable versus, say, 1,500 TPS?
Well, I think we're going to see widespread adoption over all of those time frames. I think over the next year, you're going to see a lot of institutional adoption, bringing a lot of big dollar numbers, but not necessarily a lot of activity. But I think that's going to enable the sort of widespread adoption over the 3 to 5 year time frame. I think you're going to see the next wave of DeFi applications that solve real-world problems like payments, like sensible investments, like loans. Yeah, I mean, if you think about what do people use, they have savings accounts, they have checking accounts, they have retirement accounts. I think you're going to see that mass adoption where people get those traditional financial services from blockchains like the XRP ledger over that 3 to 5 year time frame. As far as the TPS goes, you can sort of imagine a couple of different worlds. I think the least likely world is where the XRP ledger sort of stays stuck at the current TPS level, and then really only high-value transactions occur at the layer 1. That's kind of okay because obviously high-value transactions are where, by definition, that's where most of the money is, but that doesn't really solve the world's problems. I think another version of the world is where it scales to very, very high TPS levels through sharding. So what you can do is if you have, instead of one ledger, if you have 2 ledgers and you have a transaction that executes here, and then finishes, you have the sort of 2 or 3 phase execution. So you can have thousands of ledgers that together we think of as the XRP ledger. And so yes, we may have to make 3 transactions instead of 1, but we have thousands of ledgers to do it on. You could even have sort of ephemeral ledgers that you use for a short period of time, and then you throw them away. So let's say you wanted to have a ledger that had 10,000 transactions per second. It was somewhat centralized. But if you're going to throw it away after a week, it doesn't really matter. If it doesn't work, you just don't use it, and it can't steal assets from you because you have to move assets onto it. But I think the more likely world is scaling through things like ZK rollups. I think that's what most people, think is of what's going to happen. So layer 2 through ZK rollups will allow that type of scaling. But we'll see. Everybody's working on it. Everybody understands that we need to scale better, and all of these techniques, are being explored throughout the industry. We don't have that much time, though. I think we have maybe 2 more years before we've got to figure out, but there's a lot of work going on scaling through ZK rollups and layer 2s now. And I was kind of down on it just because it seemed like every time we solved one problem, another problem would pop up, and it just felt frustrating. It didn't feel like progress. But in the past couple of months, it feels like we've beaten down the big problems, and the problems that pop up are smaller problems. And so, although it's not we don't have perfect solutions yet, we have solutions that are really good and that can be used, and that's enough. That you don't have to have a perfect solution. I know I like a perfect solution, but we have practical solutions that I think we could go live with if we had to, and I think they're just going to get better.
Progress is progress. Our next question is from Wrath of Kahneman.
Great name.
Can you explain how Ripple leverages AI on the XRPL to manage liquidity? Are there any noteworthy effects?
So we really don't yet. I'm not as bullish on AI as most people are. I'm sort of an AI skeptic. I'm big on AI for documentation because I can write technically detailed documentation and I can write introductory documentation, but I can't write documentation for a particular person to meet their needs. AI is really good at finding information and synthesizing it in exactly the right form that you need, and it's surprisingly reliable at that in constrained problem spaces. I'm also excited about AI to do things like regulatory compliance and monitoring. Classifiers, I know LLMs get all the interest, but AI classifiers are really good. I've been experimenting with them for stock predictions, so that's kind of cool. But they're also good for saying basically like this account is known to belong to an exchange, this account is known to belong to an institution, this account is known to be part of a scam. What does this account look like, this account that we don't know? And they're really good at it, and they require much less human intervention. I'm also optimistic on using AI for sort of personal financial management, like, like balance, like if you have a retirement account, this is how much, when I'm going to need my money, this is how much I think I'm going to be able to put in, this is my risk tolerance. It's going to be interesting when we have all of these on-chain assets that people could put their money into, and they might be able to do staking, and they might have access to leverage. A human being trying to think through that and balance their needs against it is going to be almost impossible. So, but on most of the other AI use cases, I'm not bought in yet. I'm still a skeptic. Again, another area where I'd love to be wrong. I'd love to see AI like provide better liquidity. I'd love to see AI. I'd love to see blockchain make AI better somehow. I've heard a lot of pitches, and there's people who think that. I'm skeptical, but again, love to be wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
I'm with you on that.
You're a skeptic too?
Yeah.
Well, I hope you're wrong.
All right, our next question is from Shahryar. With so many new developments happening in crypto, what are 2 to 3 things that you would recommend investors and enthusiasts focus on and learn about in the next year or two?
I think the big thing over the next year or two is going to be meeting like the real financial needs of like normal people, of ordinary, collectibles. Most people don't need collectibles, and like high risk, high reward assets. That maybe people in this room, but like most, that's not really great mass adoption scenario. So what I think is really interesting is low risk, moderate reward investments for normal people. So portions of tokenized real estate portfolios, portions of tokenized loan portfolios, tokenized money market funds, securities of all kinds. This idea that in a couple of years, we'll have a mass market of blockchain-enabled investors who are looking for places to put their money. I think that's a big, in the United States, we're overserved by the financial system, and there's a couple other countries where people just have great access to great investments, but most of the world doesn't. And I think enterprise we can't find that inside the blockchain space. Like we can do over-collateralized loans as a sort of tax optimization for people who hold a lot of crypto, but there's not enough of that. And yes, you can speculate on the crypto ecosystem. It's high risk, but like we're finally at the point where we can provide the sort of investments that ordinary people need. Well, we're about a year out, and so that idea of millions of people who can get their funds on and off a chain easily, targeting that market with like interesting things for them to do with their money is going to be, the most exciting, I think, the most exciting sort of mass adoption, retail, DeFi use case for developers to be on. Yeah,
I'd love to see that.
I like the name of Dingo ate my XRP, by the way. Is that something that we actually have to worry about? I don't know.
You're getting ahead of me, David. It's my job to read the slide.
Oh, sorry. Is that the next one? I'm sorry. Spoilers. Sorry. I'll wait until the slide comes up.
David jumped the gun here, but our next question is from a dingo ate my XRP.
Yeah, I saw it come up on the monitor ahead of time, and I was just sorry. I just couldn't help reacting. It's hilarious. Is that something that anybody actually worries about?
Anybody have that experience?
No.
All right, I think we're safe, at least for now. Maybe the dingoes will get more powerful over time. I don't know. How have your beliefs about native cryptocurrencies and their potential role as bridge assets changed over the years? Do you see stablecoins as taking on a larger portion of that role?
I think stablecoins will grow in that role, but I think the market is exploding so quickly that I think like the role of native cryptocurrencies as bridge assets is going to grow as well. the advantage that native cryptocurrencies have is they're not tied to any jurisdiction. They're native on a blockchain, and so that anybody can hold them. They can easily move. They're not subject to they're not as regulated. I think for bridge assets and the sort of long tail of enterprise assets, I think they have an advantage. I think when because they're not tied to particular jurisdictions. I think stablecoins will take on a significant portion of the role of payments and providing liquidity. But again, I think the whole pie is going to grow so quickly that I don't think we should think about it as like one thing is going to take away from another. Maybe one thing is going to slow down another's growth, but the whole DeFi ecosystem right now is like $120 billion.
Right.
And even just small portions, just specific things like loans or specific things like treasuries in TradFi are trillions of dollars. I think access to these assets, including stablecoins, is going to be a long tail of assets where liquidity between them is going to have to be through some sort of a neutral asset. But it's going to be interesting to see. I think there will be competition between cryptocurrencies and stablecoins. I think the scariest situation for cryptocurrencies, like the bear case for cryptocurrencies, is like one stablecoin takes over the world, and then nobody wants to use anything else for anything. That doesn't seem very likely. I'm not super worried about that. It seems like that we're actually seeing a multiplicity of stablecoins, even though it does seem like the US dollar is going to be the #1 asset. And actually, that's an interesting positive. You might think that the fact that the USD stablecoin, USD has won the stablecoin, race by a the largest euro stablecoins are still, You might think that that's bad, but actually that's good because there's a significant portion of the world that uses euros. There's a significant portion of the world that uses currencies that are not dollars. And if there aren't good stablecoins for those currencies, then it will fall to other assets to provide liquidity between them. And by definition, you can't be stable to both dollars and euros. You can be stable to one and only semi-stable to the other. So I think it's going to be interesting. I think native cryptocurrencies and stablecoins are going to fight for market share. And I think what's also interesting is that we'll be able to manage the volatility better. Volatility is both opportunity and cost. And if the opportunity exceeds the cost, then the volatile asset should have an advantage. So you could imagine a case where I could hold a whole bunch of a stablecoin. But if I held a whole bunch of XRP instead, I could sell the upside and the downside to somebody else. And so I don't have the downside risk because somebody else wants the upside. If we have a good way to do that, then there's really no reason for me to hold the stablecoin rather than XRP. I'll actually get more yield from the XRP by selling the volatility to someone if the upside's worth more than the downside. And that seems to be like there could be some traction that way. So we'll see.
Yeah. Our next question is from Daniel, CEO of the XRPL, Keller. What's the best food, and why is your answer cheese?
I mean, I don't know that cheese is the best food, but cheese is great. I like cheese on a burger, cheese on my nachos, cheese on my pizza. I am a huge pizza fan. I don't know that I could say that it is the best food. It's almost not fair because cheese is a category of food. That's like saying, what's your favorite food and why is it meat? Why is it fruit?
Mine,
or why is it fruit? Why is it vegetables? Cheese is almost a food group.
Yeah, there's so many different types of cheeses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By the way, any fans of vegan cheeses here? Yeah, why try? Why even, vegetables are delicious. Just be what you are.
Our next question is from Sunny Sun. As the XRPL's core protocol evolves to support high-scale liquidity for tokenized assets and payments, how do you envision the role of retail users versus institutional players in maintaining the XRPL's decentralization and liquidity health?
So decentralization and liquidity are kind of different. Decentralization, I think everybody wants decentralization. Even the institutions that are coming to layer ones, they want them to be decentralized. They don't want them owned and controlled by their biggest competitors, which is what would happen. So I don't think there's a tension there. I think that's good. I think that's going to work out really well. Liquidity, my very first vision for the XRP ledger, as soon as we had the idea for issued assets and a DEX, was this idea that you could have pools of liquidity that were open and neutral that anybody could contribute to and draw off of. I'm looking forward to both enterprises, institutional players, retail users, developers, and ordinary people contributing to pools of liquidity and drawing off them on a level playing field. You know, I knew the Forex business and international payments pretty well. And if you know Forex, like the costs are microscopic. And if you compare it to cross-currency payments, it's night and day. On the XRP ledger, cross-currency payments use the liquidity from the order books. Like, it's just a no-brainer. And I think, you know, having institutional participants and retail participants is going to be awesome.
Next question is from Dolly. What do you see as the benefits and drawbacks of stablecoins being issued privately versus by governments as CBDCs?
I'm glad stablecoins won. You know, I think more choices are good, and I think I'm not opposed to CBDCs unless you try to force people to use them. But I'm glad that stablecoins won in the market because I think they're a freer, more open, more liberty-friendly currency, and also it's a revenue opportunity for Ripple. So I mean, win-win for me. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad that the market sees the benefits and drawbacks of stablecoins as completely swamping CBDCs. It looks like the market for CBDCs is all but dead. And a little sad because, again, I like people to have more options, but I like when people pick better options. So I'm going to call it a win.
Like ones run by Ripple? All right, our last question is my favorite, by Crypto Gamer. If you were to become one of the Spice Girls, what would your Spice name be?
So there's two ways to interpret this question. So you could say if I became one of the existing Spice Girls, and then I would have to be Ginger Spice because she's the coolest, she's the brains behind the operation, she's the snappiest dresser, she's the one with the mic drop moments. I mean, I would definitely have to be Ginger Spice. But if you're going to create a new Spice Girl for me to be, I think you could have Crypto Spice, right?
Sure, why not?
Why not? I am living in fear of what is going to be posted on Twitter or X now with the I just see it now, all the posts with Crypto Spice at the bottom, and I just am living in fear of what you guys are going to use AI to create in that image field.
Yeah, sure, why not? What would your hit song be?
Yeah, that one, I'm going to have to ask you guys for that. OK, so you guys have to come up with my hit song or an album cover. I got a challenge for you guys, OK? So me as Crypto Spice, you need a song name or album title. So get to work, guys, and I don't know, I'll retweet the best ones, maybe.
There we go, the challenge to the XRPL community. All right, that's unfortunately all the questions we have time for. I'm also getting a little hungry. So thank you so much for being here and answering all these questions for us.
Thank you, Mayuka. So I get the last word. I get the last word at Apex this year. Thanks to all of you, everyone in the room, everybody watching online for making this such an incredible Apex. Thanks to the developers. Thanks to students, thanks to the sponsors, thanks to the presenters, thanks to the presenting sponsors, thanks to the sponsoring presenters. I don't know if that's a thing. Maybe I made that up. Every year, I leave this event inspired by what the community is building. This year, more than ever, it really feels like we're hitting a new phase. Guys, keep building, keep experimenting, keep pushing this ecosystem forward. I'm looking forward to see all of you at Apex next year. Thanks. Safe travels home. See you next time.